The night before her wedding, a woman who had never in her life owned anything of real value sat alone on the bare floor of an empty apartment, counting out the last $41 to her name, and wondering how on earth a stranger's $3 million had managed to make her feel poorer than she had ever felt before. Her name was Hannah Whitfield. She was 52 years old, a widow, a caregiver, a woman the world had long ago decided was nobody worth noticing. And in less than 24 hours, she would marry one of the richest men in America, a man she had met only weeks earlier, a man who had offered her a fortune to become his wife. The whole country thought they knew exactly what kind of woman would say yes to that. Every single one of them was wrong. Because what Hannah Whitfield did the morning after that wedding would not stay quiet. It would travel from a small town in Ohio to newsrooms in New York, to talk shows, to kitchen tables and comment sections on 3 different continents, and 40 years from now people would still be arguing about the same impossible question. Was she the most foolish woman who ever lived, or was she the only honest person in a room full of people pretending? To understand what she did, you have to understand the offer itself, and the man who made it, and the secret he carried so carefully that he was willing to spend a fortune just to keep it from ever being spoken out loud. This is a story about money. But it was never, not for 1 second, about the money. By the time the news broke, the verdict was already in. The headlines wrote themselves before anyone bothered to learn her name. Gold digger. Opportunist. A poor woman, a dying billionaire, $3 million on the table. The math looked simple to everyone who glanced at it from a distance, and almost nobody looked any closer than that. They saw a worn coat and a courthouse and a man with more money than most countries, and they filled in the rest with the cheapest story they could imagine. But the people closest to it kept noticing things that did not fit. Why this woman, out of every woman in America? Why did Theodore Marsh, a man who had spent 40 years avoiding cameras, marriage, and human beings in general, suddenly want a wife at all? And why did he want her so badly that he was prepared to pay? There were 3 questions that sat at the center of this entire story, and for a long time nobody could answer a single one of them. Why would a billionaire pay a stranger $3 million to marry him? Why did it have to be her, specifically, when he could have chosen anyone, and what exactly did she do the next morning that turned the laughter into silence? We are going to answer all 3. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the truth, when it finally came out, was something nobody in that town and nobody in that newsroom was prepared to hear. To know who Hannah Whitfield was, you have to go back, long before the money, long before the cameras. She was born in a town so small it barely held onto its name, a place of 2 stoplights and 1 diner and a church that doubled as everything else. Her parents worked themselves down to nothing and left her with 2 things: a stubborn sense of pride and a deep distrust of anything that came too easy. From the time she was a girl, Hannah believed that a person should earn what they had, that charity handed down from above carried a quiet insult inside it, and that the only money worth keeping was the money you could look at and say, "I worked for that." It was the kind of belief that sounds noble until life decides to test it, and life would test Hannah Whitfield more thoroughly than almost anyone she knew. She married young. His name was Daniel Whitfield, a soft-spoken man with rough hands and a gentleness that surprised people who only saw his size. Together, with almost nothing, they took over the lease on that 1 small diner on the edge of the highway, and for years they poured everything they had into it. It never made them rich. Some months it barely made them anything at all. But it was theirs, and Daniel had a habit that drove the bookkeeping half to ruin and that Hannah secretly loved him for. He could not turn away a hungry person. If someone came in with empty pockets and a hollow look, Daniel would feed them and wave off the bill and say it was the day's special, in the house, and Hannah would shake her head and let him do it anyway. They didn't know it then, but one of those nameless, hungry strangers would change the entire shape of their lives. The years were not kind to them in the way years often aren't, slowly and then all at once. The highway they sat on got bypassed by a newer, faster road, and the customers thinned, and the diner that had been their whole world finally closed its doors. Daniel took work where he could find it. Hannah trained as a home health aide, learning to care for the old and the dying in their final stretch, sitting with strangers through the longest nights of their lives, holding hands that no one else would hold. She was extraordinarily good at it, not because she was trained to be, but because she genuinely could not look at a suffering person and walk past. It was the same instinct Daniel had carried into that diner. Give what you can. Ask for nothing. Keep your dignity even when you have nothing else left to keep. And then Daniel got sick. It started small, the way these things do, a cough that wouldn't leave, a tiredness that sleep couldn't fix, and by the time anyone took it seriously it had already moved past the point of taking back. For 3 years Hannah nursed the man she loved in the same careful, patient way she had nursed so many strangers, except this time there was no shift to clock out of and no going home, because she was already home, and the dying man was hers. She spent everything. She spent the savings, then the equity, then the money she didn't have, signing papers she didn't fully understand because the alternative was telling Daniel no, and she would not tell Daniel no. When he finally passed, on a gray morning with her hand in his, Hannah Whitfield was left with 2 things again, just like her parents had left her. A stubborn sense of pride, and a mountain of debt taller than anything she could see over. What made the debt unbearable was not the size of it, though the size of it was the kind of number that stops feeling like money and starts feeling like a sentence. What made it unbearable was the shame, the particular, private shame of a woman who had built her whole life on the belief that you pay your own way, and who was now buried under bills she could not pay no matter how many hours she worked. She sold what little she had of any value. She took the extra shifts, the holiday shifts, the overnight shifts nobody else wanted. And still the number barely moved, because debt like that grows in the dark while you sleep, feeding on interest and penalties and the simple cruelty of being poor, and Hannah began to understand that she might carry this weight for the rest of her natural life. That was the woman the world would later call a gold digger. A woman who, at 52, worked double shifts caring for other people's dying parents because the debt collectors called her phone so often she had stopped answering numbers she didn't know. She lived in a small rented apartment with a leaking faucet and a heater that worked when it felt like it. She gave the extra portions to the patients who had no visitors. She refused tips she felt she hadn't earned. She had built her entire identity on the simple, unbreakable idea that you do not take what you have not worked for, and now that idea was the only thing standing between her and a kind of despair she didn't dare look at directly. She had no idea, none at all, that a man with more money than she could imagine had spent the better part of 30 years searching for exactly her. That man was Theodore Marsh. The world knew him as Theo Marsh, the manufacturing magnate, the recluse, the name on 1,000 buildings and the face on almost none of them. He had built an empire out of steel and stubbornness, starting with nothing and ending with more than he could ever count, and somewhere along the way he had become a kind of ghost, a billionaire who lived alone in a 40-room house and trusted almost no one. He had never married. He had no children. He had outrun every photographer and dodged every interview, and the few people who had ever gotten close to him described the same strange thing, a man surrounded by everything, who seemed to be permanently waiting for something he never explained. In a desk drawer in that enormous, silent house, Theo Marsh kept a single creased photograph, the one possession in 40 rooms that he would not let anyone touch, and not even his oldest lawyer knew whose face was on it. People who worked for Theo Marsh over the years described a man who seemed to be serving a sentence in his own success. He ate alone. He walked the long halls of his house at night, unable to sleep. He had everything a person could buy and nothing a person could not, and the staff learned long ago not to ask about the photograph in the drawer. There were rumors, of course, the way there always are about rich and solitary men, that he had lost someone once, that there had been a tragedy, a betrayal, a secret child, a hidden grief. The truth was both simpler and stranger than any of the rumors, and it would not come out until the very end, but the loneliness the rumors tried to explain was real enough. He was a man quietly waiting to settle an account that no one else knew he owed. The only family Theo had left was his younger sister, Vivian Marsh Calloway, and Vivian had spent the better part of 2 decades quietly measuring the curtains. She was the kind of woman who calculated. She had married into a name, divorced out of it, and circled back to her brother's fortune like it was a tide that would eventually have to come in. She visited Theo just often enough to call it devotion and rarely enough to mean it, and in her mind the arithmetic was already settled. He had no wife. He had no children. When he died, and he was getting closer to that than anyone outside the room knew, everything would flow naturally and rightfully to her. So you can imagine, you can almost feel the cold drop in her stomach on the day she learned that her dying, solitary, never-married brother had suddenly decided, at 61 years old, that he wanted a wife. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, a stranger's lawyer knocked on Hannah Whitfield's door with an offer that made no sense at all. The man at the door was Gregory Pierce, and everything about him belonged to a world Hannah did not. The suit, the watch, the car idling at the curb that cost more than every car she had ever owned put together. He was in his 60s, careful and quiet, and he carried a leather folder the way other men carry something fragile. He asked if he could come in. Hannah, suspicious as her parents had taught her to be, kept him standing in the doorway and asked him what he wanted. And Gregory Pierce, lawyer to one of the richest men in the country, looked at this tired woman in her scrubs and her thin apartment and said the most absurd sentence she had ever heard. He said his client wished to marry her, and was prepared to pay her $3 million to say yes. Hannah laughed. It was the only honest reaction she had. She thought it was a scam, the cruel kind that targets people exactly like her, people drowning in debt who might be desperate enough to hand over a bank account number to a stranger with a nice watch. She told him to leave. But Gregory Pierce did not behave like a con man. He did not push, did not flatter, did not produce any forms for her to sign on the spot. He simply set a card on the small table by the door, told her the offer was real and the offer was serious, and told her that his client did not expect an answer that day, or even that week. He asked only that she think about it. Then he left, and Hannah stood alone in her apartment holding a business card that read, in plain letters, the name Theodore Marsh. She knew the name, of course. Everyone knew the name. And that was precisely what made it impossible to believe. Why would a man like that, a man who could have anyone or anything, want to marry a 52-year-old widow with empty pockets and a debt she'd carry to her grave? It made no sense, and Hannah Whitfield did not trust things that made no sense. For 3 days she told herself she would never call. For 3 days the collectors called instead, and the heater gave out, and the math of her life pressed down on her until she could barely breathe under it. And on the 4th day, against every instinct her parents had drilled into her, she picked up the card, and she dialed the number, and she told herself she was only calling to find out what the trick was. She had no idea she was about to meet a man who already knew her, even though she had never once laid eyes on him. Those 3 days were among the longest of her life. She told no one about the offer, partly because no one would believe her and partly because she was ashamed of how much she had begun to think about it. She would catch herself doing the math at 2 in the morning, $3 million set against a debt that had no bottom, and then she would be disgusted with herself for even running the numbers. Because running the numbers felt like the first step toward becoming exactly the kind of person she had spent her whole life refusing to be. She thought about what Daniel would have said. She decided he would have laughed first, and then gone quiet, and then told her to go and at least find out what the man wanted, because you never turn away from a stranger without first looking him in the eye. So, against everything in her, she went. They met in a room that felt more like a museum than a home. Theo Marsh sat in a high-backed chair by a tall window, thinner than his photographs, older than his years, with eyes that watched her cross the room as if he were reading something written on her that she couldn't see herself. Hannah came in braced for a predator, for a charmer, for some manipulation she'd have to fight her way out of. Instead she found a quiet, sick, exhausted man who looked at her with an expression she could not place, something almost like relief, as though he had been holding his breath for a very long time and could finally let it go. He offered her tea. He asked about her work. And then, with no ceremony at all, he confirmed it. He wanted to marry her. The $3 million was real, paid on the day she signed, no conditions she could see, no fine print waiting to bite. Hannah did what Hannah always did. She got suspicious, and she got direct. She asked him why. "A man like you," she said, "could pay anyone. You could hire companionship. You could buy 100 prettier, younger, easier women than me. So why would you waste $3 million on a tired widow you've never met?" And Theo Marsh did something strange. He smiled, very faintly, and he said, "I have my reasons, and they are good ones, and I will tell you all of them. But not yet." She didn't like that answer. She told him so. She told him she did not take money she had not earned, that she would not be bought like a piece of furniture, that whatever this was, she wanted no part of being someone's purchase. And the moment those words left her mouth, the strangest thing happened. The color drained out of Theo Marsh's face. He went pale and still, and for a long moment he didn't speak at all. When he finally did, his voice had changed, gone soft and unsteady in a way that didn't match the powerful man the world feared. He said, "I don't take money I haven't worked for." He repeated her own words back to her, slowly, like he was holding something precious he was afraid to drop. And then he said the line that would haunt Hannah for weeks, the line she would turn over and over in her mind trying to make sense of. He said, "I know. That's exactly why it had to be you." She asked him what he meant. He wouldn't say. He told her only that she would understand everything in time, that he was not buying her, that the marriage was something he needed for reasons the world would misjudge, and that he was asking her to trust a dying man to keep his word. It was the maddening, impossible turn of it that finally hooked her, because Hannah Whitfield had spent her whole life unable to walk away from a suffering person, and here was the most suffering, most solitary man she had ever met, asking her for help dressed up as an offer. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the debt that would follow her like a shadow for the rest of her days. She thought about the patients she sat with at 3 in the morning, the ones whose families never came, and how she had always believed that nobody should die alone if she could help it. And she made a decision that she could not fully explain even to herself, a decision that would put her face on every screen in the country. She told Theo Marsh she would sign his paper and take his money, but only on her own terms. "I will not be your trophy," she said. "I will not sit in a big house and spend a dead man's fortune. If I marry you, I will earn it. I will care for you. I will work. And Theo Marsh, the recluse, the ghost, the man who trusted no one, looked at her with eyes gone wet and nodded like a man who had just been told a prayer was answered. She signed her name. She took the check. And the next morning, the entire world found out what kind of woman they had been laughing at. The wedding was small, a courthouse, a handful of witnesses, a flurry of cameras that someone had tipped off, because someone always does. By the time Hannah walked down those steps as Mrs. Theodore Marsh, the story was already loose in the world, and the world had already decided how it ended. They had the poor woman. They had the dying billionaire. They had $3 million. They wrote the rest themselves, and the rest was ugly. She was a schemer who had trapped a sick old man. She was a predator dressed up as a victim. She was, in the words of one particularly vicious headline, proof that everyone has a price. And out in front of the cameras, performing her grief in advance, was Vivian Marsh Calloway, telling anyone who would listen that her poor, ailing brother had been manipulated by a gold-digging nobody, and that she intended to protect him from this disgrace. The public ate it up. They had their villain. They were sure of her. And then, the very next morning, Hannah Whitfield did the first of the things that did not fit. She did not move into the mansion. She did not buy a car, or a wardrobe, or a single thing for herself. Instead, she showed up at Theo Marsh's enormous, silent house at 6 a.m, in her own worn scrubs, carrying her own small bag, and she informed the stunned household staff that she would be caring for her husband herself. She refused the master suite. She took a small room near his, the kind a nurse would take. And when the reporters camped at the gates demanded to know what she planned to do with $3 million, she told them, plainly and without drama, that she had placed every cent of it into a trust she did not intend to touch. Not a down payment. Not a splurge. Nothing. The gold digger, it turned out, had not spent a single dollar of the gold. You would think that would have been enough to end it, but the machine that had built her into a villain could not simply stop, because the villain was profitable and the truth was not yet visible. So the story bent instead of breaking. The reporters who had called her a gold digger now called her a calculating one, a woman playing a deeper game, refusing the small money only to position herself for the large. Talk shows ran segments dissecting her every choice as proof of a master plan. A man who claimed to have known her years ago sold a story to a tabloid, painting her as cold and grasping, a story that fell apart the moment anyone bothered to check it, but which traveled around the world before the correction managed to travel across the street. The lie, as it always does, ran fast, while the truth was still tying its shoes. The spectacle outside the gates took on a life of its own. Vans lined the road. Strangers drove in from neighboring counties just to stand at the fence and stare at the house, as though proximity to the story might let them in on its ending. Online, the debate split families and coworkers and entire comment sections into two camps, the ones who were certain she was a fraud and the ones who could not quite say why they doubted it. Petitions were started. Think pieces were written. A woman none of these people had ever met became, for a few strange weeks, a national argument about money and motive and what kind of person takes what kind of deal. And through all of it Hannah Whitfield said almost nothing. She gave no interviews. She defended herself to no one. She simply went on doing the quiet work behind the walls, where no camera could reach. The story should have collapsed right there, but a story this satisfying does not die so easily, and the theories only multiplied. She's playing a longer game, the experts said. Why settle for $3 million when the whole fortune is in reach? She's manipulating him slowly. She's after the will. She's smarter than she looks, which was the cruelest thing they could say about a woman they'd just called stupid. Behind the gates of that house, though, something was happening that none of the cameras could see, and behind the scenes, something darker was lurking, something far heavier than greed, or so it seemed to the few who watched it unfold. Because Hannah Whitfield was not playing a game at all. She was doing the only thing she had ever known how to do. She was taking care of a dying man, the way she'd taken care of dozens before him, the way she'd taken care of Daniel, with a tenderness that no contract had asked for and no money could buy. Inside the house, Vivian Marsh Calloway worked a quieter campaign. She could not be there often, but when she came with questions, dropped carefully among the staff like seeds in soft ground. Had they seen the wife near his medications? Had they noticed her near his papers? Was it not strange, she would murmur, how attentive this stranger had suddenly become to a dying man with a fortune. She was building a case, witness by witness, doubt by doubt, and she was good at it, because suspicion is the easiest crop in the world to grow. And for a time it seemed to take root, because the staff did not yet know what Hannah knew, and the very same things that looked like devotion to one set of eyes looked like strategy to another, and nobody in that house could yet tell which set of eyes was seeing clearly. There was a night, near the middle of it all, when Hannah nearly walked away from the entire thing. She had overheard two of the staff repeating one of Vivian's whispers, and the unfairness of it, the sheer exhausting unfairness, landed on her like a physical blow. She packed her small bag. She stood in the dark hallway of that enormous house, a paid-off debt on one side of her and her own good name on the other, and she came within a breath of choosing her name and leaving forever. And then, from down the hall, she heard Theo Marsh call out in his sleep, the helpless, frightened sound of a sick man alone in the dark, and she found that she simply could not do it. She set the bag down. She went and sat with him until morning. It was never the money that kept her there. It was the same thing that had kept her at every bedside of her entire life. She learned his medications and his pain schedule. She learned that he barely slept, and she learned to sit up with him through the long, hollow hours when the house was dark and the staff were gone. She read to him. She argued with him about nothing, the way people do when they've decided to like each other. And slowly, in pieces, Theo Marsh began to talk. Not about business. Not about money. About the past, the distant past, the part of his life he had never told a single living soul. He told her that there was a time, long ago, before any of the steel and the buildings and the name, when he had been nothing at all. Broke. Beaten down. So far past the edge of his own life that he could no longer see a reason to keep walking it. He told her there was a stretch of weeks, 30 years gone now, when he had been the kind of hungry, hollow-eyed stranger that most people stepped around on the sidewalk and tried not to see. He told her about a diner. A small, failing diner on the edge of a highway, in a town so small it barely held its name. He told her that he had walked in one cold afternoon with nothing in his pockets and no plan beyond getting warm before he was thrown back out, and that a big, soft-spoken man with rough hands had set a plate of food in front of him and waved off the very idea of paying, calling it the day's special, on the house. He told her he had come back the next day, and the next, for the better part of a week, too proud to say thank you and too desperate not to come, and that the man fed him every single time. And he told her that one of those days, the man's wife, a young woman with tired eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw, had pressed a few folded dollars into his hand on his way out the door, and that when he'd tried to refuse it, when he'd said he couldn't take what he hadn't earned, she had looked him dead in the eye and said, "Neither can I, so go earn it, and come back and tell me you did." Hannah's hands had gone still. The room had gone very quiet. Because she knew that diner. She knew that big, soft-spoken man with the rough hands and the habit he could never break. She knew the young woman with the tired eyes and the stubborn jaw, because she had been that young woman 30 years and a whole lifetime ago, and the words Theo Marsh was repeating to her now, "Neither can I, so go earn it," were words she had said to a nameless stranger she had long ago forgotten and never once thought of again. She looked at the sick old billionaire in the bed, and she finally, slowly, understood that he had not chosen her by accident. He had not pulled her name from a list. He had spent 30 years and a private fortune looking for the woman from that diner, and when he found her at last, he found her drowning, and he found her too proud to ever let him simply throw her a rope. Theo Marsh told her the rest that night, the whole of it, the part he had carried alone for 3 decades. He told her that the few dollars the young woman pressed into his hand had not been about the money. He had bought a bus ticket with them and a meal, but those were just things. What had actually saved his life was the second half of the sentence, the part that said, "Come back and tell me you did," because for the first time in longer than he could remember, someone had spoken to him as though he had a future worth coming back to. He told her he never did go back, that shame and momentum and the long years carried him away, and that by the time he had become a man who could have walked into that diner and bought it 10 times over, the diner was gone and the people in it had scattered, and he didn't even know their names. But he never forgot what they looked like, and he never forgot what she said, and he had kept a single creased photograph he'd taken from the road that day, a snapshot of a young couple laughing outside a roadside diner, the only photograph in his entire house that he would not let anyone touch. He told her that when the diagnosis came, when the doctors gave him the number of months instead of years, the only regret he could not make peace with was that one. He had spent his whole life proving he could survive without help, and he had become so good at it that he had forgotten how to give any, and now he was dying with a fortune he had never once enjoyed, and the only people in the world he wanted to leave it to were 2 strangers from a diner he could barely picture. So he had hired people, quietly, expensive people, and he had searched. And the search led him to a small Ohio town, and to a closed diner, and to a fresh grave with the name Daniel Whitfield on it, and to a widow working double shifts to outrun a debt that would have been nothing, less than nothing, to a man like him. He could have paid it off with a phone call. And he knew, the moment he learned who she was, that she would never let him. That was the entire reason for the marriage, the reason for the $3 million, the reason for the strange and public spectacle the whole world had misread. Theodore Marsh knew, because Hannah had told him to his face within minutes of meeting him, that she did not take what she had not earned. A check would be torn up. Charity would be refused. The only way, the only possible way, to put security into the hands of a woman that proud was to make it a transaction, to give her something she could call a job, a marriage, a thing she had agreed to and worked at and could look at without shame. He had dressed a 30-year-old debt up as a business arrangement, because it was the only currency she would accept. The world thought he was buying a wife. He was paying back the only kindness that had ever saved his life, in the only way the woman who gave it would allow. And here is the part that turned everything the world believed completely inside out. All those weeks that the cameras at the gate had been filming a gold digger guarding her investment, what they had actually been filming was something else entirely. They had been filming the woman from the diner, taking care of the hungry stranger, one last time, at the very end of his life, exactly as she had at the beginning of it, asking for nothing, the way she always had. The pieces fell into place. The line he could not explain, "That's exactly why it had to be you," made a terrible, beautiful kind of sense now. The photograph in the drawer made sense. The relief on his face the day she walked in made sense. And as the truth slowly leaked out of that house, carried by staff who had watched it happen and could no longer keep it to themselves, the public mood began, very slowly, to turn. But the story was not over. Because Theodore Marsh was failing fast now, and there was one more thing he had done that not even Hannah knew about, a sealed letter held by Gregory Pierce, marked to be opened only after he was gone. In the days that followed, as Theo weakened, Hannah found herself doing something she had not done in years. She talked to him about Daniel. She told him about the diner, the real version, the long years of it, the slow death of it when the highway moved away, the way Daniel had kept feeding strangers right up until the very end, even when there were stretches when they could barely feed themselves. And Theo listened the way a man listens to the missing pages of his own story, because that was exactly what they were. Two strangers, bound for 30 years by a single afternoon that neither of them had ever once spoken of out loud, finally telling each other the whole of it. He laughed, just once, weak and surprised, when she described Daniel waving off a bill, because he had been on the receiving end of that exact wave, and the sound of his laughter in that silent house was a strange and tender thing to hear. Theo Marsh died on a quiet morning in early spring, with Hannah's hand in his, the same way Daniel had died, in the same patient and unhurried company, two men a lifetime apart, both leaving the world held by the same pair of tired, gentle hands. He went peacefully, they said, and those who were there said that near the very end he had looked at her and said only thank you, and that it was unclear whether he was thanking her for the long nights of the past few weeks or for a plate of food on a cold afternoon 30 years before, and that perhaps, in the end, there was no difference between the two. The recluse, the ghost, the man the world had feared and never known, slipped away in a small room in a great house, attended not by a wife he had purchased but by the one person on earth who had ever treated him like he was worth saving. And then the will was read, and Vivian Marsh Calloway's lawyers came ready for a war. The numbers in that will did not just raise eyebrows. They detonated. Theodore Marsh had left almost the entirety of his fortune, hundreds of millions of dollars, to his wife of a few short weeks, Hannah Whitfield. To his sister Vivian he left a comparatively modest sum, generous by any normal standard, insulting by the standard of a woman who had measured those curtains for 20 years. And Vivian did exactly what everyone expected her to do. She declared war. She announced she would contest the will, and she marched back in front of the same cameras, telling the same story with new fury, that her dying brother had been preyed upon by a calculating stranger, that the marriage was a sham, that a woman who would marry a dying man for money would obviously now take the whole estate, and that she, the grieving sister, would fight to her last breath to stop it. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like she might win, not in a courtroom but in the only court that ever really decides these things, the court of public opinion, where the gold digger story had always sold better than the truth. And then Hannah Whitfield did the second of the things that did not fit, the thing nobody saw coming, the thing that finally, truly shocked the world. Before the lawsuit could even get its footing, before the war could begin, she gave it all away. Not in pieces. Not as a publicity gesture with her name on a plaque. She honored the wish that Theo had sealed in a letter and left in Gregory Pierce's careful hands, and she took the fortune she had legally, undeniably inherited, and she poured almost the entire thing into a foundation. A foundation built to erase the kind of medical debt that had nearly buried her, for families exactly like hers, and to fund warm meals and second chances for the kind of hungry, hollow-eyed strangers that a young couple in a roadside diner had once refused to step around. She named it the Daniel Whitfield Foundation, for her husband, the man who could never turn away a hungry person, the man who had, without ever knowing it, fed the boy who would become a billionaire. The foundation did not stay a headline. It went to work. In its first year alone it erased the medical debt of thousands of families who would never know whose generosity had freed them. Families who opened a letter one ordinary afternoon to find that a weight they had carried for years was simply, quietly gone. It funded diners and shelters and meal programs in small towns like the one Hannah came from, places where a hungry stranger could sit down and be fed and be told, without a single hint of pity, to go and earn it and come back. Theodore Marsh had spent 40 years building a fortune that bought him nothing but distance from other people. In the end, in the hands of the woman from the diner, that same fortune finally did the one thing he had never once managed to do with it himself. It reached people. She kept almost nothing for herself. She paid off her own debt, the mountain that had chased her for years, because Theo's letter had begged her to, and she allowed herself a small, modest peace, a paid-off house and the freedom to stop running. But she did not buy the cars or the clothes or the life the world had been so certain she was after. She went, for a time, right back to the work she had always done, sitting with the old and the dying through their longest nights, holding the hands no one else would hold, because that was who she was, with $3 to her name or 300 million. It had never made any difference to her at all. And in the single act that silenced even her loudest critics, she did not freeze Vivian out, did not punish her, did not spend $1 fighting the war Vivian wanted. She quietly increased what Theo had left his sister, and made sure she was cared for, because, she said simply, he would have wanted his family looked after, and revenge was a thing she had never once had any taste for. Vivian, for her part, never apologized, and Hannah never asked her to. The lawsuit she had so loudly promised quietly evaporated, because there was nothing left to fight over once the prize had been given away, and because a woman cannot easily go on television to accuse a stranger of greed after that stranger has handed an entire fortune to dying families and kept almost none of it for herself. Some said Vivian had been humbled. Others, who knew her better, said she had simply recalculated, the way she always had, and decided that a generous settlement and a quiet exit cost her far less than a public war she could no longer hope to win. Either way, she faded out of the story she had tried so hard to write, and the story, which had begun as a tale about a woman chasing money, ended instead as a tale about the only person in it who had never wanted any. That was the moment the laughter finally stopped, all of it, everywhere. The same headlines that had branded her a predator now scrambled to recast her as a saint, which she also was not, and never claimed to be. She was simply a woman who had told the truth about herself from the very first minute, in a doorway, to a lawyer she didn't trust. "I don't take money I haven't worked for." She had said it and she had meant it, all the way down, and when a fortune the size of a small kingdom landed in her lap, she looked at it and decided she had not earned it, and so she gave it to the people she thought had. The world had spent months certain it understood Hannah Whitfield. In the end, she was the only person in the entire story who had never once been confused about who she was. The last thing Gregory Pierce did, at Hannah's request, was read aloud the letter Theo Marsh had left, the one sealed for after his death, and its words traveled further than any headline ever had. In it, Theo wrote that the richest thing he had ever owned was not the steel or the buildings or the name on 100 walls. It was the memory of being treated like a human being on a day when he had felt like nothing, by people who had nothing themselves and gave it anyway. He wrote that he had spent his whole life building a fortune and his last few weeks finally learning what it was for. He wrote that he was not buying a wife and he was not buying forgiveness, because there was nothing to forgive, only a debt of kindness so old and so large that the only honest way left to repay it was to put everything he had into the hands of the one woman he knew would never spend a cent of it on herself. And he closed it, that hard, solitary, impossible man, with a single line. "Tell her I came back, like she asked. It just took me 30 years. So in the end, what do we make of Hannah Whitfield? The world looked at a poor woman and a rich man and $3 million and it saw the oldest, cheapest story there is, and it was so sure, so loudly and confidently sure, that it never once stopped to ask whether the woman it was mocking might be the only person in the room telling the truth. We are quick, all of us, to decide who someone is from the outside. The worn coat. The empty bank account. The convenient marriage. We fill in the rest with the worst version we can imagine, and we call it common sense. But Hannah was never the woman in the headlines. She was a young wife pressing a few folded dollars into a stranger's hand and telling him to go earn it and come back. She was an old widow doing, at the end, exactly what she had done at the beginning, asking for nothing, keeping her dignity, and giving away the one thing she had decided she had not earned. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves us with, long after the fortune is given away and the cameras have moved on to the next easy villain. How many Hannahs have we walked past? How many times have we looked at someone and been absolutely certain we knew exactly what they were, only to be flatly, completely wrong? So I want to hear from you, honestly, in the comments below. If a stranger handed you $3 million and asked for nothing real in return, would you have trusted it, or would you have run? Was Hannah the wisest woman in this whole story, or did she give away a fortune she had every right to keep? And the hardest one of all, if you had been watching this unfold on the news, before you knew the truth, are you sure, really sure, that you wouldn't have judged her too? Tell me down below where you're watching from and what you would have done, because I read these, and the answers people give say as much about us as this story says about her. And if this story moved you, if it surprised you, stay close, because the next one will too. Because if you think a billionaire repaying a 30-year-old plate of food is the most unlikely inheritance you've ever heard of, wait until you hear about the housekeeper who was quietly written out of a will after 40 years of loyal service, and the single faded photograph, hidden inside an old book, that put her right back into it, and brought an entire powerful family to its knees. That story is waiting for you. Subscribe, so you never miss it, and so you never miss any of the true stories the headlines always get wrong. Because the truth, when you finally hear all of it, is almost never the story you were sold.